photographs be taken?
Yes.
Why?
It was apparent to me that these blood droplets were not directly associated with the victims and that they were perhaps in association with the bloody shoe prints leading from the scene. It was also apparent that they would be connected to a suspect in this instance.
And so what were your instructions to the criminalist with respect to these blood drops that you've identified in people's 19 and 20?
To photograph, preserve, and collect these as evidence.
And with respect to all of the items that you have previously identified in the photographs we have marked during the course of your testimony, were those all items that you requested be collected by the criminalist and photographed in place as they were found?
Yes.
And are they depicted in the photographs as you found them, sir?
Yes.
Now, did you attend the autopsies in this case
Yes.
and observe them of both Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman?
Yes.
Showing you the exhibits previously marked as Peoples 3 and Peoples 2, can you tell me whether these are the people whose autopsies you were present with respect to this case, sir?
Yes. People's 2, I believe it is Mr. Goldman. People's 3 is, in fact, Miss Nicole Brown.
In your presence, sir, were blood samples taken from each of those people?
Yes.
And did you retrieve those vials of blood that were given to you, that were made by the coroner during the course of the autopsy?
Actually, my partner, Detective Van Atta, retrieved them on the following day. I believe it was June 15th.
Sir, are you familiar with the term DR number?
Yes.
What is that?
DR is letters for what in LAPD we term a DR, or Division of Records number. This is a number that is assigned to a particular crime, to a particular victim. The first 2 digits would indicate the year. Something occurring this year would be preceded by the numbers 9-4. The second 2 digits would indicate the geographical division involved. In this case, geographically, West Los Angeles division is 8, so it would be 08. And the 5 subsequent numbers are the individual report numbers.
And is there a DR number assigned to this case, sir?
There are 2 DR numbers, 1 for each victim.
Do you know what they are?
9408174331 and 32.
The 31 number, is that the main number?
Yes, it's what we call a key number. It would be the first number obtained that all subsequent reports would be keyed off.
And the 32 number exists to designate a second victim?
Yes.
Is all of the evidence collected in this case assigned that DR number?
Yes.
And which one would it be assigned, the 31 or the 32 number?
The first one, the 31 number, yes.
So if it bears that number, that indicates it was the evidence recovered in this case?
Yes.
Yes. I have nothing further.
Mr. Shapiro?
Good morning, Detective Lange.
Morning.
Is this case still in the process of an ongoing investigation?
Yes.
And have you, from the onset until the present time, been getting leads on possible other suspects?
Yes.
And are you investigating those leads?
Personally, I am not at this particular point. They are being gathered, categorized, and we're assigning them out as quickly as we can.
Who is in charge of investigating other leads?
At this point, it's Detective Payne.
And how many people are under his direction investigating these other leads?
The number varies. Again, we're trying to prioritize the amount of information we're getting. He probably will have anywhere from 6 to 10 or perhaps more people, depending on the amount of information coming in.
Do you know what stages these leads are in terms of development?
Very, very early, I would say.
According to all the information you have received, was the first call relative to this investigation a call that there was a burglary suspect at 874 South Bundy Drive?
It seems to me there was a call to that effect, a prowler or something like that. I don't recall exactly.
Do you have any records of the first call that was received that resulted in this investigation?
I believe we might have. I haven't checked that. I don't know for sure.
And the officers who took that call, are they required to record that type of call?
The officers who responded to
No, who
this,
received the call that there was a burglary suspect?
well, I'm sure they recorded, yes. There's a daily field activities report that most units fill out that they'd have it on.
The exact time of the radio call and the type of the call are required by LAPD policy to be recorded, are they not?
It certainly should be, yes.
Do you have any information as to how that call regarding a burglar suspect at Bundy was broadcasted?
No, I don't. Again, I'm not familiar with the particular details of that radio call. It's just my knowledge that I believe there was a previous call to that location.
Do you have any information that this call was broadcast on June 13th, 1994 at approximately 0010 hours?
Do I have information?
Yes.
There's very possibly information in the book.
And you have would this radio call be a high priority call?
It would depend. If a suspect were at the location at that time, it would be a high priority call. If the suspect had left, not necessarily, unless the suspect's still in the area. Again, I don't know what the details were in that call.
Was the location of this call 874 South Bundy, directly across the street from the homicide scene?
I don't recall the address.
Do you have any records of that?
I believe there are some records.
And
It seems to me it was right in the vicinity, though, yes.
If it was 874 South Bundy Drive, would that be directly across the street from the homicide scene?
Yes, it would.
Did you or anyone under your staff, anyone in your staff, locate the person who initiated this phone call?
I did not, and I'm not aware of anyone else who did, other than the responding officers, perhaps.
Did you or anyone under your direction interview anybody at 874 South Bundy?
I honestly can't give you an answer. We've done in excess of 100 interviews, and we've had perhaps a dozen investigators doing this. We have information coming in all the time. I really don't know.
Does a radio call of this nature cause to generate an incident report?
It would probably depend on whether or not a crime has occurred. If it were just a prowler call, perhaps it would just be a mention in their activities report. If a crime had occurred, then of course he'd be required to take a crime report.
What if it said burglary suspect there now at 874 South Bundy Drive? Would that type of radio call generate an incident report?
Not necessarily.
Do you know if an incident report was generated?
No, I don't.
If such a report was generated, would that be included in the murder book?
I would hope we would eventually get that.
Have you seen such a report in the murder book?
I don't recall seeing a report to that effect.
Was there any report that the burglary suspect that was there was a Caucasian?
Again, Mr. Shapiro, I'm not familiar with the details of that report.
Are the first officers at the scene required to protect the crime scene and cordon off the vulnerable areas?
Yes.
Are the officers required to determine if an ambulance crew or any other person moved the body or any items within the crime scene?
It would be helpful, but they're not necessarily required to do that.
Are the officers required to record the names, addresses, and date of births and telephone numbers of all persons at the crime scene?
That's preferable, again, yes.
If an ambulance crew is present, are the officers required to record their names, serial numbers, and obtain a rescue report?
They should do that, yes, on a crime scene log, that's correct.
Was such a crew there?
I don't believe so.
Would you check your chronological
Yes.
record, please?
If you give me a moment, there are several logs, several incidents here.
Maybe I can help you with that. Why don't you look at...
I believe I have it, thank you.
OOCA.
Yes, I have it, thank you.
Does that indicate whether any emergency crews were there, other than
I'm
police?
checking, it's quite lengthy. If I wasn't there to observe, but if I may have a moment. There is an indication of a Los Angeles Fire Department captain at the scene. It states here he was not needed. This does not necessarily mean that this was a paramedic, but a representative from the LA Fire Department.
Have you ever talked to that person?
No.
Has anybody, to your knowledge, talked to that person?
To my knowledge, no. I don't know.
Has anybody recorded the names of any other personnel that might have been there with the fire department?
Well, I'm still checking if I could have a moment.
Pardon?
Can I have a moment? I'm still checking.
Oh, yes, take your time, I'm sorry. Let me know when you've had a
Okay.
chance.
No, the only representative I see from the fire department is that captain.
Do you know what type of vehicle he arrived in?
No.
Did anyone check to see whether he inspected the bodies?
That's not indicated. All it says is not needed, so
My question was, did anyone check to see if he went to the bodies at the crime scene?
I don't know.
Did anyone check to see if he disturbed anything at the crime scene?
I have no knowledge of that.
Did anyone check to see if he came with a crew?
If he would have come with a crew, their names should have been logged, and all I see is his name, so I'm assuming he was the only one there.
Whose responsibility is it to see that no one enters the crime scene?
The officers who would have been assigned to secure the crime scene.
And who were they?
Again, referring to my log, we have officers Cummings and Sanchez, McAllen and Wally, Ziegler, and it appears to be Mauricio. The primary unit, Risky and Terrazas, would probably have had something to do with that. Also assisting officers Gonzalez and Ashton.
Have you read any reports that any of these officers generated regarding their observations when they arrived at the scene?
Irrelevant.
Sustained.
Have you talked to any of those officers?
Objection irrelevant.
Sustained.
Everybody heard, Your Honor?
Yes.
I think one of the key issues in this case is whether or not the crime scene was disturbed. And this is foundational for asking those questions.
All right.
If counsel has concerns in that regard, he could certainly subpoena the first officer on the scene who could explain what he did to secure it and how he kept people out of the scene or perhaps failed to do so. But asking this detective who appeared on the scene some 4 hours after the first officer appeared is ineffective. There's no way that this officer could possibly know what transpired before he arrived, and asking him what was done and who came in and who did not would all call for hearsay and speculation.
Well, I think here, since we're back now to the preliminary hearing, if the appropriate foundation had been established with regard to the number of years that this detective has with the department, which I believe that was part of your early testimony, hearsay would probably be admissible, assuming that he's not acting as a mere reader officer and that information was imparted to him by some other person. So the objection is overruled, subject to the appropriate foundation.
Thank you, Ron.
Did you read any of the reports that were generated by any of these officers?
Yes.
Have you talked to any of these officers?
No.
Do you know if any, did you ask any of them if they did anything at the crime scene upon arrival?
Personally, I did not. It was done by someone else.
Who was that done by?
Detective Phillips.
And did he report that anything was done at the crime scene by any of these officers?
Well, it's pretty vague. If you'd like, I could tell you what the reports indicated.
Yes, would you?
The reports, each officer was interviewed separately as to what they did at the location, where they stood, where they stepped, whether or not they were injured. And there are reports as to each officer. Each officer's shoe prints were photographed, and they each gave a statement as to exactly what they did at the scene.
Is there any policy regarding how persons can enter a cordoned off crime scene?
Is there any policy?
Yes.
Well, again, policy is a guideline. No two crime scenes are alike. Therefore, we have policy, but again, policy is merely a guideline. It can't dictate to you how to handle any particular crime scene.
Is the policy generally that no crime scene shall be entered except in the accompaniment of an officer?
You could interpret it as generally being that way, but again, it's merely a guideline.
And to caution anybody who does regarding contamination or alteration of evidence.
Certainly.
Was that done in this case?
Again, I was not present. I would certainly hope it was.
Now, did you and your partner, Detective Van Adder, arrive together or in different vehicles at the Bundy crime scene?
Separately.
Who arrived first?
Detective Van Adder.
And you arrived how much later?
Yes.
How much later did you arrive, do you know?
Oh, I believe it was approximately 20 or 25 minutes.
And did you observe the crime scene to be secure when you entered?
It was secure in my mind, yes.
Were tapes, ropes, barricades placed in proper positions?
There was yellow police tape that was up, and there were uniformed officers, I believe, stationed at the front and the rear of the location.
In your opinion, was it properly barricaded?
If you refer to yellow tape as barricades, yes, there were no actual barricades.
I'm asking in your expertise as the senior member of the special unit, whether or not that crime scene was properly cordoned off at the time you arrived.
In my mind, it appeared to be, yes.
Upon arriving, did you cause to record the weather conditions and the temperature at the crime scene?
Initially, I did not.
Is there any importance to doing that?
There may be, or may not be.
And what would the importance be?
The importance certainly may be perhaps one factor of many in determining the time of death.
Is the time of death an important criteria to establish in a homicide investigation?
I would say in most instances, yes,
In this case, would it be?
certainly.
And is it true in your experience that the earlier you begin the investigation process regarding trying to establish the time of death, the more likely you are to establish the time of death?
Not necessarily.
So you would not agree with that?
Well, again, it's a general statement. There would be instances certainly where that would be true, and there would be instances where it wouldn't be necessarily be true,
In this case, would it have been true?
perhaps.
And you, as the senior detective there, were in charge of alerting criminalists, the coroner, and any other support unit you would need to conduct a proper investigation. Is that correct?
Well, in conjunction with my partner, yes.
And what time did you notify the coroner's investigative unit to come out to help ascertain the time of death?
I had requested another detective on the scene to make what we call a first call to the coroner's office to alert them what we had. Subsequent to that, another call is made telling them that we're ready for them. I don't recall who made the call.
Is there any record of that? Is that in your chronological log?
That may well be with the coroner's log.
Is it in your chronological log?
I don't believe I have it in my chronological log.
Is that something that you should have in your log?
Not necessarily.
What time did the coroner's investigators arrive at the crime scene?
Would you like me to refer to the homicide log?
If you don't know,
I have no personal recollection.
do you have a general idea how many hours it was after the initial
It seems to me it was probably approximately 10 o'clock, 9:30, 10, 10:15, somewhere in there. But it's only a guess.
Would you feel more comfortable in reviewing your notes?
It doesn't matter to me if you'd like me to. Do you want a specific time?
If you're comfortable with that answer, fine. If you're
Well,
not-
no, again, I ask you if you would like a specific time. If you would, I can look at the log for you. I don't recall a specific time.
We would like to get the answer that closely resembles exactly what occurred. So if your notes would help you in that, we would appreciate it.
Well, it's in the log.
Please check that then.
The personnel log at the scene indicates that Coroner's Representative Ratcliffe arrived at 9:10 a.m. and Coroner's Representative Jacobo arrived at 9:20 a.m.
Are you familiar with the term rigor mortis?
Yes,
And is that a factor that's used to determine the time of death?
it can be, yes.
And in a case involving a homicide like this one, would it be important to try to establish the time of rigor mortis as close to the time of the actual death? Or establishing later the time of death?
The time of rigor mortis, I don't understand. Rigor mortis is an ongoing thing.
Does it set, is it that determination a time determination? In other words, is that a determination that if made earlier is more helpful, or it doesn't matter when it's made?
Objection. Vague, ambiguous, calls for a conclusion from a non-expert witness of an expert nature.
Sustained, there's no foundation that this detective knows the answer to that.
Okay. Thank you, Your Honor. Do you know the answer to those things?
I'm sorry.
Objection, Your Honor. But that was the whole point. No foundation was laid.
I think that you'd have to sort of lay the foundation before you ask the general conclusion. Does he know the
Are
answer?
you an expert in homicide investigations?
I guess that's open to interpretation.
Have you qualified as an expert in
I have.
homicide investigations?
I have.
On how many occasions?
I've been court qualified on at least one occasion in Superior and Federal Court.
Do you consider yourself an expert in homicide investigations?
Objection, irrelevant.
Sustained.
Do others consider you an expert in homicide investigations in your department?
Calls for speculation, irrelevant. Objection.
Overruled.
All right, you would have to ask them.
Can we call Detective Van Adder, please? We'll proceed.
All right.
You guys are very modest, I must say. Are you familiar with such terms as lividity, temperature change, digestion in the stomach, and eye fluids as they relate to time of death?
Yes.
Are any of those things important criteria in establishing time of death?
They can be.
Are all of those important criteria in establishing the time of death?
They certainly can be.
Now, you called for a criminalist to come to the scene, is that correct?
I personally did not, but I,
At your direction?
Yes, yes.
At your direction. I know you don't dial the phone for all these things, but you're kind of like the coach or the quarterback. And you tell other people what to do?
sometimes,
Did you in this case?
yes,
And that was your job?
yes,
And you told somebody for a criminalist to come out?
yes,
In the first place you directed the criminalist to come was to Rockingham, isn't that correct?
I don't recall exactly how that happened. I know that he was directed to Rockingham first, though.
And did you consider Rockingham to be a homicide scene at the time he was directed there?
No.
Did you consider Bundy to be a homicide scene?
Yes.
Of the two, which did you consider to be more important in terms of priority to get a criminalist to?
More important to get a criminalist would be Rockingham.
And that was before you and the other officers made your emergency entry into that location, wasn't it?
I believe the request for a criminalist to test the apparent blood stain on the vehicle was before.
Was before.
I believe it was. I'm a little unclear because I left the Rockingham location shortly thereafter to return to the Bundy location.
Do you have any records to indicate the time that the criminalist arrived at Rockingham?
I was not present when he arrived at Rockingham.
Well, my question is, do you have any records to indicate the time the criminalist arrived?
I may have in my possession. Like I said, there are many logs here.
Well, that's something that you are required to record, isn't it? What time a criminalist initially arrives at a crime scene?
Well, I would hope somebody would, certainly.
Would you check and see who did that and what time the criminalist arrived?
I don't know, and I don't have that information, if a separate log was kept after I left the location. I'll have to go through quite a bit of material here.
Now, you've got your lieutenant here, and you've got two deputy district attorneys. Maybe you could take a moment, and the four
I
of you
think,
might be able to find this.
Mr. Shapiro, we'll take the morning recess at this time, and that
might
should
be a good time to
facilitate.
find it. Yes, thank you, David.
We're again on the record in the case of People versus Simpson. The defendant is present with counsel. The people are represented. Mr. Shapiro.
Yes, I believe there was a question pending. Do you recall the question, Detective?
So may I have it repeated, please?
Yes. Do you have records to reflect in your chronological log what time the criminalist first arrived at the Rockingham scene?
I don't know.
Did you check with lieutenant and deputy district attorneys and anyone else you had?
I checked with my partner who was at the that particular scene, and he indicates there was no log made, that was not a crime scene at that time. In fact, would you like me to explain that a little bit?
I think you've answered the question.
Okay.
Thank you. Did you file any reports, supplemental reports, or follow-up reports as to what time the criminalist arrived at the Rockingham location, up until including today?
I didn't. That would be filed by the criminalist himself. He would have his own information, his own log.
And have you seen such a report?
I haven't seen it, no.
Do you know if one exists at all?
I am assuming a criminalist report does exist, yes.
That wouldn't be something that you would want to maintain in your murder book, though, now?
Once I get it, yes. We haven't received many things, and that's one.
Isn't the criminalist one of the closest people you work with in a homicide investigation?
Objection
Again,
vague. What does closest mean?
One of the most important, I'll rephrase that, and I
All
think
right.
counsel's correct.
Well,
Would you say a criminalist is one of the most important members of your investigative team in a homicide case?
That would depend certainly as to evidence in the crime scene. Subsequent to that, not necessarily, but certainly I'd say as to collection of evidence.
In this case, would you say that he would be one of the most important members of your investigative team?
As to the collection of serological evidence, yes.
And is that a very important aspect of this case, in your opinion?
Yes.
Is it maybe the most important aspect of your case?
Evidence-wise, I would say there's a good possibility of that, yes.
And as of today, you still have not received any reports from him. Is that your testimony?
No, I've received reports from him, but the reporting procedure is ongoing. The investigation is ongoing. I get reports from various entities on a daily basis, sometimes as many as 50 or 100 pages of various things.
When you and your partner and the two West LA homicide detectives left Bundy to go to Rockingham, who did you leave in charge of Bundy?
Lieutenant Rogers.
Did you instruct him, even though he's your supervisor, as to what to do?
Basically, what to do was to secure the scene until I arrived, until I returned.
Until you came back?
I'm sorry?
Until you came back?
Yes.
And that meant not to let anybody in or out and maintain the perimeter?
Not necessarily.
What did that mean when you told him, when you gave him instructions that you were leaving?
To secure the location and that we'd be returning.
What did that mean? What were you conveying to Lieutenant Rogers to do?
That I was leaving for a short time and that I would soon be returning.
And what was he to do at your direction?
Remain at the crime scene.
And do what? Sit there, go to sleep, investigate?
Make sure that no one disturbed the crime scene, basically.
So he was now in charge of no one entering that crime scene area?
No, not necessarily.
Was he in charge of continuing the investigation? at
He was
Bundy?
he was in charge of anything that might have come up while he was there until I arrived back.
Would you say that your investigation had been completed at the Bundy scene at the time you left for Rockingham?
Well, certainly not, it hadn't started.
And did you instruct him to do anything regarding the crime scene investigation as your supervisor when you left to go to Rockingham?
The instructions were that it was mutually understood that he would remain there until I returned. There were no specific instructions to do this or to do that.
Does the murder book or chronological record indicate whether Lieutenant Rogers conducted a crime scene investigation in your absence?
I don't believe you would find that in there.
Did you ask him if he did?
No.
Is that something you'd want to know?
If Lieutenant Rogers conducted the crime scene investigation?
In your absence, yes.
No, it was a mutual understanding that in fact was my duty and that I would do that once I returned, perhaps with his assistance.
What time did you return to begin your crime scene investigation at the Bundy location?
It was approximately 6:45 a.m.
So that's now 6 hours and 45 minutes after the report, the last report of the deaths. Is that correct?
Roughly.
Is there any benefit in starting a crime scene investigation as soon as possible?
There certainly could be.
Could there be in this case?
Well, that would be open to speculation, and certainly down the road, we may know more about this case, and we'd find out at that time. At this point, it's kind of up in the air.
Based on what you know now, would it have been your preference to conduct a crime scene investigation at Bundy as soon as possible?
Not necessarily.
That's irrelevant and it's vague.
Sustained.
When you went to Rockingham, did you direct any officers to do a door-to-door search of the surrounding neighbors?
Objection, vague, search.
Are you talking about the surrounding neighbors at Bundy or surrounding
At Bundy,
Rockingham?
at Bundy,
At Bundy?
yes.
And by search, just what do you?
Let me clarify that was a very poorly phrased question, Your Honor. Did you direct any officers to door knock surrounding residents to ascertain if anybody saw anything at Bundy?
I don't recall doing that, no.
Do you have any notes to reflect you did that?
No.
Would you say that it would be appropriate to start at 874 South Bundy where a suspicious person was reported to begin looking for potential witnesses?
Not necessarily.
Have you reviewed up until today any communication tapes to see if there were any prowler or burglar calls in the immediate area prior to June 13th, 1994 at 00110 hours?
No.
During your investigation, have you determined if in the last few years there have been any similar homicides reported in Los Angeles?
Objection, vague.
As to similar?
Similar to what? In what way?
Similar to, let me rephrase that.
All right.
Similar to the homicide you're investigating in this case.
On the same objection with respect
Do you
to
mean a double murder of an adult male and female?
Yes, similar circumstances that a male and female were murdered under the same or similar circumstances. That's one of the things you do in your investigation, isn't it? To see if there are patterns of homicides?
No, objection, it's still vague. At what circumstances? Males and females are unfortunately murdered every day. In what respect is the counsel inquiring as to the similarity?
Did you look to see if you had any similar sort of crime reports to the incident that there was on Bundy?
No, Your Honor.
Are you familiar with something called the Homicide Manual of the Los Angeles Police Department?
Yes.
And I take it you read that and you follow that?
I have read it. It hasn't been updated in a number of years, but I am familiar with it.
So you think the manual's out of date?
Well, it certainly could be. It's not a hard and fast text on how to conduct a homicide investigation.
Do you agree with this statement in the Homicide Manual that the preliminary investigation at the scene is the most important and possibly the most sensitive aspect of the homicide investigation?
I'm a little ambivalent about that. Yes and no. It certainly is important. It's not necessarily the most important thing that exists.
Would you agree with this statement in the manual that good note-keeping is the foundation of a good homicide investigator?
That's a basic that is certainly preferable, yes.
Do you agree with this statement in the manual? That accurate, comprehensive, and chronological notes not only coordinate the investigation, but allow the detective to present the possible case in court, sometimes years later.
Once again, as a guideline under perfect circumstances, that's certainly something that you would want, yes.
Were field interview cards completed on all possible witnesses?
We have over 100 witnesses. No, I don't believe so.
Were neighbors interviewed in the direct proximity of the crime scene who did not hear anything unusual between 10 o'clock and 12 o'clock?
I haven't had a chance to review all of the neighbors' statements, so I am not sure whether or not a recordation was made of that.
Were any crime scene broadcasts initiated?
Again, I haven't reviewed the communications tape. It was an earlier question, so I don't know.
Did you order that there be no smoking or eating permitted within the crime scene area?
I did not.
Have you obtained a detailed report of what all the officers at the crime scene reported and the actions they took immediately upon arrival at the crime scene?
Yes.
Have you ascertained how many officers have gained entry into the crime scene prior to your arrival?
Yes, that should be contained within their statements.
Have you asked the officers to recreate their movements?
Yes. I have not personally. It was done by Detective Phillips.
No, that's all recorded as
At my
of today.
direction, yes.
Did you ascertain if any officers smoked at the crime scene?
That too would be contained in their statements.
Did you ascertain if any of the officers or any media personnel drank any coffee at the crime scenes?
Well, objection, that's vague. And
When you say crime scenes, do you mean now both Rockingham and...
Well, there's 3 crime scenes. There's Chicago. Would you agree there are 3 crime scenes in this investigation?
I would agree that there are 2 and perhaps a third, which I would term a potential crime scene.
Let's talk about the 2 that you would determine as crime scenes. Do you have any knowledge of anybody drinking coffee within the areas of the crime scene after they were cordoned off?
At the scene, directly at the scene, no, I don't. I am not aware of anyone who was drinking coffee.
As the officer in charge, would you say that both crime scenes were protected from destruction or contamination of evidence by onlookers as well as news media personnel?
Okay, number one, I was primarily in charge of and directed the investigation at the Bundy scene. I was not at the Rockingham scene, but for a short time. I was satisfied that the Bundy scene was in fact secured, yes.
Who was in charge of the Rockingham scene?
Detective Van Adder.
Would you agree or disagree that standing or walking at the crime scene, leaning against doors, walls, or windows may destroy valuable evidence, latent fingerprints, hair, or skin specimens?
That possibility.
Irrelevant.
Sustained.
I just have a moment, Your Honor.
Yes.
Did you determine